particle to and ka. In this lesson, you'll learn the particles to and ka, and you'll be able to say and, with, and or in Japanese. Now, let's start. First, the particle to. The particle to has a couple of different uses. It works like and or with. When the particle to is used as and, to links two things like 映画館と博物館 a movie theater and a museum. Let's see it in a sentence. 昨日映画館と博物館に行きました. In this sentence, the speaker talks about the places. The particle to connects a movie theater and a museum. So, this sentence means yesterday, I went to a movie theater and a museum. When the particle to is used as with, to follows a thing. Pay attention to the fact that the word order is reversed to English. Therefore, 友達と means with a friend or with friends. Let's see it in a sentence. 先月、友達と旅行に行きました. The speaker talks about going on a trip. 友達と shows that the speaker went on a trip with a friend. So, this sentence means last month, I went on a trip with my friend. Next, let's learn the particle ka. The particle ka works like or. So, 明日 tomorrow, か あさって day after tomorrow means tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Let's see it in a sentence. 明日かあさってスーパーに行きます. The speaker is talking about the day to go to the supermarket. 明日かあさって means that it's tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. So, this sentence means I will go to the supermarket tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. Now, let's practice with some example sentences. 朝ごはんはパンと卵でした. Breakfast was bread and an egg. 朝ごはんはパンと卵でした. 昨日、友達と映画を見ました. Yesterday, I watched a movie with my friends. 昨日、友達と映画を見ました. 来週、山か川に行きます. Next week, I will go to the mountains or the river. 来週、山か川に行きます. The next lesson is ある and いる. See you in the next lesson. Thank you for watching.